Welcome to Flute Tube. Last week I talked about incorporating arpeggio practice into your practice routine or into that of your students. And today is just one little last note to tack on to that episode. I mentioned at the end of that last episode, you can find here if you need to, that there are a couple of ways you can just barely begin to incorporate arpeggios into practice. And these are like baby steps. Once you or your students feel confident about playing arpeggios in the smaller, simpler ways that I mentioned today, you can take the leap into more substantial arpeggio practice. A great first step that you can make with arpeggio practice is simply to tack them onto the end of your scales. So if you learn 2-octave scales and you're practicing those, then you can simply at the end of your scale, if you're playing an F major 2-octave scale, you tack on at the end there an F major 2-octave arpeggio. It doesn't even matter how you're practicing your 2-octave scales, whether you're going up the circle of fifths adding sharps, down the circle of fifths adding flats, going chromatically by tonic, C, then C sharp, then D, and so forth. It doesn't even matter whether or not you know all 12 major scales. If you know some of your major scales, 2 octaves, then you can tack on arpeggios. Of course, you could do it with 1-octave scales and arpeggios as well if you want to take that very first step. Either way, you simply start attaching arpeggios to your scale practice so that they become familiar early on. Then as you learn minor scales, you do the same thing. Usually I do this with 2-octave scales. So if I have a student who can now play a 2-octave D natural minor scale, I will have them also play the D minor arpeggio at the end of that scale. What happens when you've learned all the forms of minor? Say that you can play natural minor, harmonic minor, melodic minor, and your minor arpeggio. Then I would have a student do all three, natural minor, harmonic minor, melodic minor, and once they've played all three scales, then play the minor arpeggio. This all leads to what I have heard called Mammma scales, maybe more appropriately Mammma scales, because what you do in the end is that you can tell your student to play on a certain tonic, on a given tonic, say D. All these scales and arpeggios. And the reason it's called Mammma scales is that first you do your major scale, then you do the major arpeggio, then you do your 3 minor scales, probably in this order, doesn't have to be, but it makes good sense. Natural minor, harmonic minor, melodic minor, and then you do your minor arpeggio. So Mammma scales. The other quite basic, simple way I wanted to mention that you can practice arpeggios is to stick with triads. I mentioned in the video last week that the first set of arpeggios I like to have students do is major triads, minor triads, dominant 7th chords, diminished 7th chords. But before you get to that place, if you want to keep things including music theory a little simpler for your students, you can do sets of 4 triads. Again, they don't have to go through the whole circle of fifths. You could do this one tonic at a time. You can have them do it starting on C. That would be C major triad, C minor triad, C diminished triad, and C augmented triad. Then maybe once you get to that point, you graduate to doing these 4 triads on F, B flat, G, D, however you want to approach it. This is also a good way to solidify a bit of very basic music theory regarding how do you build a minor triad versus major, how do you build a diminished triad or an augmented triad. Players do develop more confidence about playing major versus minor, diminished, augmented if they've been accustomed to doing these triads. I hope this all makes sense. There are so many different ways to practice arpeggios. If you have a favorite way to practice them, or teach them to your students, introduce students to the idea of arpeggios, please leave a comment. If I've said anything confusing, please leave a comment and I will get back to you. I'm always happy to further explain something if it's hard to understand from the video. I mentioned last week's video on arpeggio practice already, and I also have an arpeggio video from a couple of years ago that is a lot more advanced arpeggio practice, mostly dealing with 2 arpeggio exercises from the Taffanel and Gobert Big Daily Exercises book. And if it does turn out that any of the information I've given you today is helpful, please like this video. Thanks, and have a lovely May from all of us here at FluteTube.